Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reimagining Children's Residential Care. I'm David Fairhurst here at Mutual Ventures. I'm the Exec Chair, and in this afternoon's webinar, we'll explore the critical challenges currently facing the children's sector in the commissioning of residential placements for children and young people. Most of you will know the backdrop. In March this year, the Competition and Markets Authority launched its study into the children's social care market. This followed a call from Josh McAllister, Chair of the Independent Review of Children's Social Care, to look into the placements market, following complaints from within the children's sector. In September, the CMA confirmed that it had received no evidence to support a market investigation, which is a blow to those who argue the current system for commissioning placements for children is broken, resulting in excessive profiteering by some private sector residential care providers. The CMA is, however, still undertaking a market study, not an investigation, and it is due to publish its full findings in March next year. Headlines from the study's interim report, which was published just at the end of October, were that there is a shortage of appropriate places for local authorities seeking to place children. The largest private providers could be earning higher profits than the CMA would expect in a well-functioning market. And the report also highlights risks of private equity owners going into financial distress and ultimately having to exit the sector due to the high and increasing levels of debt. From our own conversations with colleagues across the sector, it is clear that these are widespread issues and the pressures are acute. The status quo cannot be sustained. Action is needed and in many cases is being taken by commissioners. Today, we'll explore some of these issues in more detail with our panel, chaired by Andrew Christie, and we'll consider the range of potential alternatives to traditional outsourcing in a presentation from my colleague, Emmett Regan. We do have a change to the advertised lineup. Unfortunately, Bernie Brown and Alan Madeley have been unable to make it today, but I'm delighted to say that Colin Foster has agreed to join proceedings. If you'd like to pose questions to our panel, please use Zoom's Q&A function throughout, and we'll have some time towards the end of the hour to address as many of these as we can. Without further ado, I will introduce and hand over to Andrew Christie, CBE, who will chair our panel today. Andrew was DCS in the former Tri-Borough Partnership between Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea and Hammersmith and Fulham councils, and he is now chair and non-executive director at Birmingham Children's Trust, the largest arm's-length provider of children's services in England. He was appointed by DfE as Children's Commissioner to oversee improvements at Northamptonshire Children's Services as they prepared to transfer to an independent trust. Andrew, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you very much indeed, Mutual Ventures, for organising this event, which couldn't come really at a better time for the very reasons you've just described in your opening remarks, David. To add just to that kind of very brief CV, I actually began my social work career in residential childcare more than 50 years ago. I was kind of reminded of some of the sort of kind of basic issues actually when I watched Ed Bull's program, or the first one in the series, which he's doing. I'm sure some of you or others have already seen it. But if you haven't, I'd really recommend it, because what it reminds you, although it's about adult social care, I think it's got quite a lot of very relevant lessons for children's residential social care as well, because what it reminds us all of is that residential childcare is an extremely skilled task. It's an extremely challenging one. It's very difficult to provide well, and many of us will have come across many people in our careers who are residential workers who do what they have to do so very well and with such skill, but at the same time probably have an experience which is one of being undervalued, not always as well rewarded as they should do. And as David said in his introductory remark, of course, residential childcare covers, that description covers such an enormously broad range of provision. I was talking to my colleague, one of the directors in the Children's Trust, David Stringfellow, who has responsibility for residential care in the Birmingham Children's Trust, and he described what's happening as a perfect storm. He pointed out the fact that we've actually, amongst other things, got in many parts of the country rising numbers of children and young people entering the care system. We've got rising problem of staffing, being able to recruit the kind of right people into the sector, because we're now competing with in a kind of job market which generally is kind of under huge pressure in all sorts of different ways. And we've got a regulatory process which I think many of us would probably think in some ways sadly is contributing to some of the difficulties that we have, and maybe we'll explore some of those issues in due course. We've also got in certain parts of the country closure of some of the most specialist high need kind of provision, secure provision, tier 4 CAMS provision. And overall, we've now got a critical issue of kind of shortage of provision. So what I'd hope we'll do today is we'll kind of share ideas about some possible solutions, or at least share ideas about what are kind of some of the issues that we're all wrestling with. And so it's my job to chair a panel and to introduce my fellow panelists and ask them each in turn to share some of their thoughts and experiences about what they're doing, where they're working in the system at the moment. First of all, I'd like to introduce Julie Jenkins, who's Director of Children's Services in Calderdale. I understand you first began your social work career in Leeds, and you've spent pretty much all your social work career working in the Northeast. Welcome, Julie. I'll ask you to say a few things in a moment, but before doing that, I'd then also like to introduce Colin Foster. Colin, when he turns on his camera, Colin is the Chief Executive of Northamptonshire Children's Trust. So I know Colin in the role of Commissioner. He has to put up with me offering all that kind of advice that a kind of retired DCS does to somebody who's actually kind of trying to kind of do the job at the moment. But Colin was previously DCS for Bedford Borough Council, has many years of experience as well in children's services and also in the commercial sector. So can I hand over to you, Julie, to kind of just share some of your kind of thinking and ideas in this field?
You can. Thanks very much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Jenkins, as Andrew said, the Director in Children's Services in Calderdale, and I did start my career in Leeds City Council in 1988 as a newly qualified social worker. And for those of you who worked in Leeds at the time, who may know Leeds provision at the time, they had a lot of residential beds and places where young people were living. It was around the time when there were a number of children that were on care orders for non-school attendance and for criminal activity, and the bed base was absolutely huge. And I'll just mention one of them by name. It's now a lovely residential unit called Shadwell. It's got residential provision on it now, but it was a 100-bedded unit, and it was split into 4 houses with 25 children in each house. So the size of it was absolutely phenomenal. So it had huge provision. And if you think how far we've come now with our small bedded units of 2 or 3, which is probably, what's going to give children the best outcomes compared to those huge units that we were running at the time. I think today on my colours to the mast right from the beginning, I believe in residential care. I know some people don't and think every child should be with a foster carer if possible. If possible, yes, but for some young people, I think if you've worked in practice for a long time, you know that due to some of the trauma that young people may have suffered, they do find it hard to attach sometimes to a family without some more intensive work. And I think our residential staff do an incredible job and know those children inside out because they live with them every day. So I've got a lot of time for residential staff and for residential provision. I've always been really keen, wherever I've been in a senior leadership position, to have plenty of our own residential provision and fostering, which I'm also going to mention about Calderdale too. So just to tell you a little bit about Calderdale, because it will be relevant, I think, when we get into the Q&A. We're quite a small borough. So we've got 50,000 children and 350 of those children are in care. So we call ourselves the delicatessen. We see some of the other big Mets like Leeds and Bradford being a bit more like your Tesco's and your Asda's. So we know we're a bit small and we're a bit bespoke and we're a bit niche. And because we're small, we know our kids really well. So we are graded currently good by Ofsted, and we did get an outstanding for our services to care leavers and children in care, because we're really small. We know them really well. The Ofsted inspection team met a lot of our young people, and they talked about it being like living in a family. You know, the feedback was absolutely lovely. So we do pride ourselves on our services for children in care. I'm just going to touch on fostering very quickly, because I know this is about residential, but you can't see your sufficiency and your situation without looking at both. So we do have a steady cohort of Calderdale people who care for Calderdale children. We've been very lucky to retain people. We don't lose people to the independent market. We managed to hang on to our foster carers. But I think the issue is, and it probably is across the piece, is that our cohort is getting older, and we've got a lot of traditional foster carers who've been with us a long time, who are brilliant, but we're not drawing in those kind of younger people into that kind of vocation of looking after children in care. So I think we're storing up a situation there of something we need to address as a sector as time goes by. Just in terms of our own residential provision, we've got 4 units in Calderdale. We've got a short break unit for children with disabilities that's currently rated outstanding. We've got a longer term unit. It's very settled with loads of teenage boys in it. We've got about 5 in that home, but it's such a steady cohort, and that's currently rated good. We've got a unit for much younger children who we really want to do that intensive work I talked about rehabilitation and moving them onto a foster family. And we also have a new longer term unit. It used to be another short break unit, intensive support, but because of the pressure and the demand for places, we've made that longer term, and we've taken out our team and made it into an assertive outreach team in the community. And they're working really from 7 in the morning till 10 at night on that edge of care agenda, which I'm sure we'll probably touch on as well. I just want to touch on a couple of the challenges that we are seeing in Calderdale. There is a shortage, as I know you all know. Anybody who's on this call who's got an interest in this area knows there's a shortage of external provision, particularly in fostering. And I think what is happening is there's then the knock-on looking for residential by default, not by choice, which is a really big issue for outcomes for young people. This has been exacerbated, as you know, by the changes in September to regulated and unregulated placements, because it has made the basically, the capacity is reduced even further than it was before, which is why we've got the perfect storm that Andrew mentioned in his introduction. The escalating costs is, you've got to be in it every day to manage it and believe what really is going on. And I think the average cost quoted in the Competition and Markets Authority for residential was 3,400, was it, something around that? Our prices that when we're searching for a placement has shot up to 6,000 to 10,000 a week minimum in the last few weeks alone, and we really are up against it. That's not sustainable, for any local authority budget, as we know, and it's not good outcomes for young people either, when that money could be so much better spent, as we know, on early intervention and prevention. So I'll pause there and I'll hand over to Colin.
Colin, you're mute.
I always make a point of going on mute once and then I don't do it again in every conversation. I'm going to get a t-shirt, so apologies for that, everybody. Thank you, Julie. And it's quite interesting to listen to the Calderdale story, which I've watched from afar with great admiration, I have to say. And it's interesting here in Northamptonshire, the starting point was very much the other end of the spectrum in terms of Ofsted, etc. Of course, with an inadequate judgment that still stands, local government review, going from 7 district councils and one county council into 2 unitaries. And Northamptonshire Children's Trust covers both of those unitary authorities, so it's an incredibly complex area. I won't repeat what's been said, except I agree with everything Julie and Andrew have said, that we are in this perfect storm, and it's not good. If someone came down from Mars now and said, right, how does this placement thing work? What would you say? Well, okay, the state's funded to place children for their care so they're not at risk of significant harm. The state can ask people to, if they would home those children in their house as foster carers. And then there's this whole other commercial market, which the state pays a lot of its money into. And I can say in Northamptonshire, it's north of £46 million to look after children for their care and protection. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. And then it gets a bit worse because the volume of children that need our care and support is increasing. but the number of places that they can go and stay is decreasing. That's the perfect storm that we're facing. It's a real challenge. And I always think defining the problem is part of this starting point for solving the problem. But if anyone has got the solution, please let me know, because and this is why these seminars are really useful to learn. So I'll give a little bit of context around Northamptonshire, in that we've got 5 residential homes and an educare team similar to what Julie says. And everyone works incredibly hard to get the best outcomes for the child. That is what is important. And sometimes that's a real challenge, because you want the placement to meet the needs appropriately. And then if there isn't appropriate needs, then there can be situations where you're looking for placements that you know could and should be better. And so what we've done here is made sure our team, we brought some additional resources in to work in our team to make sure that those placements are the right place for the child and that can meet their needs. And there's an incredibly detailed work goes on with the child, the voice of the child at the centre of that placement. So we can evidence quite clearly that the placements where children are placed are appropriate. However, that is becoming more and more difficult. And I think that's the hill that we have to climb, isn't it? How do we make sure that every placement is right? It's the right placement for children. So is it okay that our society can allow this to happen? I don't think it necessarily is. We've also seen an increase, and I'm sure you have, Julie, as well, an increase in looked after children of around 10% over COVID, etc., and a decrease in placements themselves. So that's the real challenge we face. Now, what are we doing about it? So I mentioned earlier about the team working really closely to ensure that the placements do meet the needs of the child. And that is a lot easier to say than it is to do, believe me. But also what we found is there are some local providers that provide some really good residential homes. And we've started working really closely alongside them. So what I found when I came here, for example, is first thing I was told was, we've got a procurement framework and that'll drive out savings. It's not procurement frameworks that drive out savings on their own, it's relationships. And I think if I was to leave with one message today, it's about what we're doing to hopefully make a difference is building relationships from the perspective of the child so we can meet their needs, as I mentioned, but also building relationships with those providers that can help. And so a really good success story recently is a local provider that there was a premises came up for sale on the high street in Northampton town. And there's residential space above, and there's kind of a shop front down the bottom. We talked through with the provider about what the art of the possible was, and so what we created. The provider said, "Okay, we're going to invest in that property, and it's going to be an art therapeutic residential placement, which we know was a gap for a number of children that we're working with. They would really benefit from that kind of provision." And so I was lucky enough a few weeks ago to go into that placement and see displayed works of art from children that are placed there in a gallery. So the downstairs was made into a gallery, and below that there's a space where the artwork, where the magic happens, is what they said. And it's great. So that provider not only provides the accommodation, they also employ they employ an artist to help support, they employ a mental health practitioner, and they also employ a careers advisor. And they work with the young people in that placement to help improve their outcomes and get the best deal for them. And I went to the gallery. I didn't go to the big opening because I didn't want to do that. I thought I'm just going to go and have a look. And 2 of the young people that painted pictures came in, and I felt like I was meeting someone famous. And then I said, "How is it? How's it been?" And both of them said, "This has changed my life." We have 1,170 children, young people in our care. And I want to be able to speak to every one of them where they have an experience that changes their life. And this was one. So that's a success story. There's a long way to go. I'm happy. I could talk for hours about it, but I'm conscious that we are restricted on time, so I'll pause there. But
thank you both very much. I think we've got a few minutes before I'm going to ask Emmett Regan to kind of share some ideas that Mutual Ventures are working on. So it's interesting, Julie. I think you talked about maybe it was a re-provision, but a new unit. And in this particular kind of climate, are either of you in your local authorities thinking of expanding your own provision? It's interesting because you've both still got kind of core of provision. And so if you are, perhaps you could just kind of share, perhaps Julie first and then Colin, some ideas about what that you're working on.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I think the first thing to say is, if I could, and we have considered this, I would really love to do the North Yorkshire no wrong door model, where you're not investing in lots more residential provision. You actually do have something that's kind of really different. I'm not going to go into the detail of that model, but I do think it's a fabulous model if you can get it to work, that actually you're not having to put a load of money and investment into creating more residential. So I think that's the first thing to say. I'm a firm believer in care services, strong communities, trying to keep children with their family wherever possible. And I think if you could invest in that no wrong door model across the country, I think it'd have a huge impact. But what you've got to do is do that as well as meeting the current demand at the same time. So we are investing in more residential provision in Calderdale. The elected members are very supportive, corporate parenting agenda across party. So this was agreed at full council, a 1.57 million investment into 2 new children's homes. That was in June. We've purchased a new house already, and the tender's out for refurbishment, and that'll be up and running by June. We are struggling to find a second unit on the market because the market's quite hot at the minute, as you know. So as properties are coming on, people are snapping them up. But we are invested in 2 more units, and we want care closer to home. That's one of our strap lines. We want children in the borough attending their local schools. We don't want them going out of the borough. A bit like you, Colin, we've got a local commissioning framework with a local provider. So we've got a block contract with about 11 beds, that we commission within the Calderdale borough. So, we know there are a small cohort of children where we can't meet their needs in the borough, where we do look for external, but we are investing, Andrew, 1.57 million into 2 3-bedded units.
That's really interesting. And again, in a couple of minutes, Colin, it sounds like you're also kind of working in kind of expanding the in-house provision. Could you just say a little bit about what you've got in mind?
Of course, and I agree. The role of anyone delivering children's services functions is to enable families to stay together where it's safe to do so. Bottom line, and that the investment in that educare space is really important. In terms of the residential market, we have the DfE opened up a bidding round recently, so we've put a bid in for another children's home. We haven't got an investment from the council to build homes, unlike Julie, unfortunately. But I agree, it's not your ideal, but we do need to do something to meet the needs. So we are doing that also through that funding bid, and hopefully that will be successful, and we'll be able to expand provision in that way. But it's a twin track approach, isn't it? It's working really hard to ensure that families can stay together where it's safe to do so. And Ofsted have been to visit Northamptonshire on a number of monitoring visits, and they are seeing the improvement and they're noting the improvement. It's all in writing now, so that's good to see, and I hope we can build on that.
So you're both in the fortunate position of having some provision already in-house to kind of, as it were, start rebuilding. Because actually, I think if you look at the history of what's happened in local authority children's services, is that by and large we've retracted, as you said, Judy, when many of us started some years ago, there was an enormous range of kind of provision in-house in almost every local authority. I think the other kind of salient point that I think both of you have made really powerfully, and I would absolutely endorse, is that, of course, the provision of residential care is but part of the picture, and if you have in place the kind of right kind of set of arrangements with the kind of sort of other forms of care. I mean, your point, Judy, interesting, very interesting, about you sometimes think that you're having to put children into residential care because of the kind of lack of kind of the right kind of alternative in the kind of fostering system, is a kind of a really important point to make. And the point that you're making, Colin, about some of the kind of other support services that you need to go with that residential care. I think actually one of the advantages that perhaps derives from thinking about your own provision is you can also plug in some of that wraparound care, which you're either managing yourself or you're able to commission again from kind of local services with whom you've got good established relationships you can build on. We'll come back to you two shortly. So I think this is the point now where Emmett, I hand over to you. Emmett Regan from Mutual Ventures. Emmett and I have worked together in a variety of settings, not least working together on the kind of establishment of the regional adoption agency kind of program, and where, again, I think there's some lessons to learn, aren't there, about kind of shared services, about collaboration between local authorities. But anyway, Emmett, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. It's funny, we hadn't rehearsed this in any way, but I've pulled together some slides of which RAAs feature quite prominently in the presentation as well. And I think some really good conversation there with both Colin and Julie. And I think really the kind of watchwords around sustainability and relationships, things that we've worked on before. So what I wanted to do today was kind of just run through three things really. One is the evidence of change. So I think things are changing around us quite quickly in various ways, with different reviews, different models of delivery, new ways of working. Two, to touch on some of the models that we've worked on before. And Andrew, I'll draw on some of the experiences from RAA, because I think things are changing. And I think if I'd said to you a number of years ago that instead of every local authority in the country doing adoption, there'd be 31 or 32 agencies carrying out adoption on behalf of local authorities, I think you would have been quite skeptical. So interesting to see, I think, the changes existing around us. And then what we thought we'd do is pull out some key considerations. So areas that we think we really need to think about. And Julie ties in really nicely with the prominence of relationships in that, and with Colin too, and the prominence of the role that individuals take. So again, just to tease out a little bit, and I don't want to be slavish to too many words on the screen, but I think if you get the chance to dip into the CMA report, it is really powerful about the dysfunction of the marketplace. And I think a few of the areas that I've highlighted in bold there are really telling. In essence, something has to change, and picking up on both what Colin and Julie said about the role of the market, its dysfunction, and how we can look at different things in different ways. And ultimately, the market is not functioning how it should be, and therefore something has to change. I also went through, not the most catchy of titles, but the Profit-Making Risk and Independent Children's Social Care Placement commissioned by the LGA. They provided an update in May this year, and really the figures are staggering. And this goes back to Colin's point about the use of public money, how that works and what that looks like. And I think something to really think about in the way that those sectors are financed and leverage the risk that's in them potentially, but then also the level of profit. And as the CMA states, whether that's acceptable or not. What I thought I'd do is, again, just kind of paint a picture of where I think there are changes that are already underway, starting with new models of delivery. And I think we've been lucky enough to work both with people on the call and more broadly in the development of new entities, new organizations within children's social care, children's trusts being an obvious one, and large number across the country now, over 10, the regional adoption agencies, which was the point Andrew made there about the difference that that's making to adoption services operating across boundaries, doing things in a different way. And interestingly, not really a one-size-fits-all model. And I think when the DFE envisaged the program, it took a lot of bravery to say, actually, we can do these in different ways. They don't all have to be the same. And I think that stood to the development of regional adoption agencies. We're seeing now the emergence of family hubs too. So I think really interestingly about how that will evolve over the coming time. Obviously, there are comparators in terms of Sure Start, but other ways of doing things. I think the emergence now of cross-authority working, so how are organizations, authorities working differently together. I think we may see something quite interesting in a new wave of local government reorganization. If you think about Cumbria, also in Northampton, where there is a single entity working across different organizational boundaries, I think is really important. And then picking up on Julie's point there about new models of practice, we're seeing this in another program we're working on in relation to strengthening families, but different practice models across the country, how they're making a real difference, of which No Wrong Door is one. And then two, just really to kind of flag those three reviews that are happening around. I touched on the CMA, which I think is giving us some really rich data about how that market is working or not working, as the case may be. And then also it would be foolish not to consider the independent review of children's social care. I think in one of the blogs from Josh McAllister, again, poses the question around local, regional and national. And obviously there's two sides to that story. I don't think anyone's slavish to a regional model, but I think there are some interesting lessons to learn about that and how we can think about that. And then the third review I flagged in relation to profit making within the sector. I'd also point to some cross-boundary working too, how that is working quite effectively and how that's coming together is the White Rose framework in Yorkshire and Humber, the Greater Manchester Sufficiency Strategy. And then I think picking up on the points that's been made already around increasing demand, I would also flag into that the increasing complexity of that demand too, where there are different need for provision and how that's being impacted within the marketplace. So just to give you a sense of some of the models that we've looked at or that we're working with, really trying to take kind of different ways of looking at this. And how I've tried to cut it in a sense is maintaining that public sector ownership, not-for-profit entities, but thinking about a singular solution where a local authority is working by itself to provide provision. An example of this is in Warwickshire, where they commissioned the first children's home, I think since the 1980s, earlier this year, to be built. So bringing that provision back in-house. And then also thinking about different entities. And again, people like me and lawyers obsess about legal form and shape, but just thinking about how you could use a model in a different way to work on placements within the authority. Potentially that picks up on Andrew's point about regulation and the role of the regulator. And then thinking in a different way around partner solutions. So how could you do something beyond the boundaries of the authority? Now, certainly we're seeing examples of that work. And I think the first step on this journey is certainly around sufficiency, planning, data, contracting, commissioning, and Colin touched on this, the importance of that, but also understanding the kind of pipeline and then what that looks like moving forward. So a use of a different partner, again, we've seen this in Birmingham, indeed, in relation to regional adoption, how the use of a VAA partner can improve the service, bring different ideas in. And then also, I think we're beginning to see the green shoots of regional working and regional solutions. Now, I think there are real challenges within that. I wouldn't be naive to suggest there's not. I think there must be an improved way of being able to tackle a challenge that a lot of authorities face. And I think what that is built on is relationships and trust. And I think that comes over time and with working with each other. So we've really seen different examples of these in different shapes and forms. But again, with the evolution of children's services, different delivery models, I think potentially this real challenge on placements, this year-on-year increase in demand, we can't do the same thing and expect a different result. And that's where I think a really effective way of delivering a market in a different way. And I think one point to really focus on here is that I think this has gone beyond politics a little bit. We during the summer spoke to at least 20 different authorities of different political configurations. And there is universal support and skepticism for the market being effective. And actually, how do we bring provision in-house? So just a really interesting point there about how the politics of this has evolved. And finally, what I wanted to do was just to give you some kind of key considerations, things to think about when maybe thinking about a different type of model or a different approach. And again, I don't think this is as much about the legal form or shape as it is as to how you improve outcomes. And I think absolutely some of that is better value for money, but ultimately, how can you correct a market that has both a moral failure within it and really poor outcomes for children in some instances, and a market failure, which is, as Julie mentioned, the kind of sky high prices, and the ratcheting up of that. So things that would be top of my list and that we work with partners across the country to think about. Certainly the budget will be key, and that budget over a medium-term position. I think the comprehensive spending review is helpful to give a degree of solidity, but I think we'll need to see what comes in terms of reforms to the local government financial settlement. Contracts and commissioning, I think, is really the first port of call, driving out efficiencies from that and how you bring partners together. I'm really buoyed to hear Colin's mention of relationships too. It's something that we think is crucial in the work that we do. And some of these are legal challenges, but a lot of these are people working together. I think our experience too around data would be the need to have real clarity on that at a really granular level. And I think a lot of work's been done in this, but if you read through the CMA's interim report, I think there is still some challenges in there. And then front and center, again, building on contracts and commissioning around the budget. So how are we thinking effectively about relationships? How are we thinking about working with people? Then some more mechanical points around infrastructure. If that is the creation of new provision, that is not an easy overnight thing and really needs to be thought through. And then thinking about the pathways, ultimately, how are you improving outcomes for younger people, I think is absolutely crucial. And then what is a slightly prosaic point, but mission critical for anyone who's worked in developing these new models are really about the support services. How do you ensure that the new entity has the resources it needs or the new model to be able to do its job effectively? So in summary, I think there is a lot of change that in fact has already happened. And I think some of it is kind of happening around us. There's some really good examples, some kind of fertile material to draw from there, I think, and lessons learned from others and people on the call. But I think my experience would be there's a real opportunity to look at doing things differently now. And ultimately, there is a real need to do that, as has been outlined on the call. So again, I think we'll share these slides around as to the participants, but hopefully there's some really interesting material in here and things that might be helpful for you if you're thinking about looking at doing things in a different way, or how you might bring some services together in a different way. So back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, Emmett. Just before I go on to kind of pick out some of the kind of themes that perhaps we want to explore following Emmett's input, can I just ask everybody who's taking part in this webinar to make use of the Q&A function, because what we would like to do is to kind of draw in both questions, but also thoughts and observations, and maybe even, in one sentence, kind of ideas and examples that you're working on, so that we can kind of make use of those in the conversation we want to have within the panel, and maybe answer some questions from the kind of panel's perspective. But we definitely not claim to have a kind of a monopoly of the kind of wisdom and knowledge and experience in this area. But equally, it will add to the material, which then we can kind of offer out and circulate to everybody. And part of the point of events like this is to give people the opportunity to connect up with each other and say, well, that's interesting, I must talk to so-and-so. But whilst I'm waiting for all those questions and ideas and comments to flood in on the Q&A function, just to kind of pick up some of the kind of challenges that you've thrown out, Emmett, collaboration between local authorities. My experience of that is, let me be honest, is a very patchy one. Sometimes you can get it to work fantastically well. I think maybe the RAA program is an example of that. And maybe part of the kind of reason for that is because there was a certain degree of compulsion. I know everybody hated it in the local authority sector, but that was the kind of bottom line. There was a kind of, there was at the bottom, there was kind of no choice really that you needed to you had to be kind of part of the program. But it is extremely difficult, in my experience, to get local authorities to collaborate with each other. There are great examples, and some of you have already made reference to it. How do we do better at that? Julie at the start, and then Colin.
Do you want me to start, Andrew?
Yeah, Julie, please.
I don't know if there's something different about the Yorkshire and Humber region, but we do work pretty effectively across the whole of the region. There's 15 local authorities, which people will know if they've had anything to do with the Yorkshire and Humber region. And as you said at the beginning, Andrew, I've worked in the region all my career. So, you know a lot of people, you have a lot of relationships, but we also have sub-regional relationships as well. So the West Yorkshire area, for example, which we're part of in Calderday, Emmett will know, we were the first regional adoption agency to go live. We had a bit of pump priming. We had £1 million, didn't we, Emmett, which did help politically to make that a reality, but we were the first ones to make it happen. And I put that down to the relationships between the West Yorkshire leadership teams, between the chief executives, between the political leadership. It does help that we're all Labour controlled. So I think there is collaboration then. We do have in the Yorkshire and Humber, and this was touched on in Emmett's slides around the White Rose framework. So we've had a commissioning framework in place for a long time, trying to get the best that we can out of the market, looking at different frameworks for fostering, for residential, for care leavers move on accommodation. That has become less limited. I think it's become limited in its effectiveness over the last few years, but it's still in place and it's still working to an extent. But what we know is that there's a lot of provision off framework that we're paying much more money for. We've done a lot of work as well with another company which Emmett will know as well, around mapping, looking at our local need in the Yorkshire and Humber region, looking at some of the cross-border areas, because I've got children, for example, from neighbouring areas in Calderdale, and I've got Calderdale children across the border in another area. That just doesn't make sense. And if you could just start afresh and start moving children around, but you can't either, because sometimes that's not going to meet their needs either. But I think there's a lot more we could do around that kind of trying to keep that closer to home, trying to use the local resources that you've got within your area. So I would think, in some areas it's probably stronger than others. Obviously, Colin, will be able to comment, from your area, but I think in the Yorkshire and Humber, we have made some great strides on it. But inevitably, when you're running your own provision, you want it to be good or outstanding. If you take children from other areas, sometimes you don't get the same commitment that you get from your own social work teams. You've got control over your own staff around visiting and the quality of the practice. So I think there are some inherent challenges there, and having, a kind of a broader collaborative footprint around residential. It's just a few thoughts from me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julie, there's a question that, in fact, it goes straight to this point. Just to say to those who are posting questions, I don't know who they're coming from. I don't know whether you're but I'll just take them as they come when we can. So the question specifically is, Julie, how can we use our regional contracts to maximise interest from providers? We have a contract that's been in place for 3 years with 6 monthly opening, but most providers are not willing to stay within the price caps or offer placements. Is that your experience with in your region as well? What are your thoughts about how you might address that issue?
I think it's really tricky in the current market. I think what we're seeing is, as I just mentioned, much more off-framework arrangements. I think providers are seeing an opportunity to make money very quickly. I think we're seeing houses being purchased very quickly, providers opening them up. They're being registered by Ofsted, usually one, very small units, 1 or 2 bedded. And I think people are taking the opportunity while the market as it is to get into that market and make some very, very quick profit. We've got an arrangement, as I said, a block contract with one provider, and we have a bit of a unique relationship with them because the 2 people that are running it used to work for me in residential. They were my unit manager and a deputy who went off and set up on their own, but they have the same ethos that we do. They're into restorative practice. They know the way we work systemically. They understand our model of care because they help create it. So that's, they're a provider that we've got a special relationship with. We block purchase, probably all of their beds that they've got in Calderdale, and we work very much hand in glove with them. And I think it comes back to that relationship, those relationships that you can forge. I don't think it's possible when you're dealing with big providers, big external providers, to have that kind of smaller relationship and that block contract arrangement, but that's probably the way to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely chimes with what you were saying, Colin, about what you're trying to do as well in terms of forging relationships with partners who are also providers. Colin, I'm going to put the next question that we've got here to you, which is, so what does the panel think about the prospect of collaboration between local authorities and the market, not just in respect of purchasing care, but in terms of actual delivery partnerships? And it's from David Stringfellow.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the relationship point's interesting, isn't it? So I'm stood here right now in Northampton, responsible for Northamptonshire Children's Trust. If I go 27 miles exactly south, I'm stood in the centre of Bedford. My regional partners here are Lincolnshire. There's 10 partners, go north as far as Lincolnshire, just south of you, Julie. And but if I'm 27 miles south in Bedford, one of my key regional partners is Suffolk. For the geographers there, you'll know that's a long way. So I think there's the regions that are set up through the ADCS network. So currently we're in the East Midlands, and there's a very strong relationship where we do have a framework. So in answer to the question, I think it's got the capacity to work incredibly well. The trick is how you work together to make sure it works the best it can, because sometimes there can be competition even if you've got a cross-authority framework, and then that creates tension in itself. So for me, I think the future, join on the things Emmett said about how authorities work together, whether it's a traditional regional footprint or whether it's a meeting of minds, I'm not quite sure. I think it might end up being the latter. I can see regional frameworks happening, but for example, my colleagues 27 miles to the south, if we both think in the same way and can see a synergy, then we'd probably work together as well. And so when I reflect on it, just hearing the conversation, Emmett's incredibly fantastic presentation, I think there's probably 3 levels in the future, isn't there? 4 levels, arguably. There's your own stuff that you do. There's the stuff that you do with other local authorities of a like mind. stuff you do with authorities that are in your region and the stuff you do with the private sector. And it's almost, maybe that's the future segmentation of how the market looks. Just a thought.
There's a point being made by Darren in the Q&A about the potential role to be played by supported accommodation, and about in Warrington what they're doing is looking to kind of expand that form of provision. Again, can I just ask you, Julie and Colin, to start with Julie, is that something you're doing? And if so, what kind of, what's your experience of it? What works well, what doesn't? And then I'll ask you, Colin, to pick that one up as well, if you are doing it.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, I can see from the person that's posted the comments and the questions that they're also doing Mockingbird, which is one of the innovation projects, as you know, around fostering, particularly in getting that kind of group and peer support that is really successful. And they're also doing No Wrong Door, which is great to see, as I mentioned earlier on. I think the pressure on supported housing and move on arrangements and care leave, for care leavers in particular, is the next area for potential huge expansion and cost escalation. It started already. So I think anything that the local authority and children's services can do with their own local housing providers to make sure that, again, you're able to meet that need locally within your own borough without having to rely on external provision, in the stronger the stronger you're going to be. So I do think it's an area for future focus. We do commission a lot of that provision, not particularly from profit making organisations, but I think the potential is there, Andrew, for that to escalate too.
Yeah, Colin, additional thoughts?
Yeah, and I've heard of the Mockingbird scheme, and I think it's excellent, and I know there's some really good stuff going on in Warrington, and I think what that leads me to think is we've talked about how we can secure appropriate placements that meet need, and it's almost a time to start looking at the nature of care, perhaps. And if you look at some of the stuff coming out of the review through Josh McAllister, etc., that there are, that is very much looking at the nature of care and the nature of state intervention and what that means and what it looks like. And so I think the space to have that discussion and dialogue about what could and should care look like going forward is a worthwhile space. The challenge that folk doing jobs like that I do, Julie does, and is simply that there's only certain things you can and can't do within the regulations and within placements. So it's creativity within a regulatory framework. And the recent, I think Julie mentioned earlier, on the 9th of September, there was a change to unregistered and regulated placements. Now, I'm not making a judgment call on that, whether that's a good or a bad thing. My point is that the whole system needs to have a look at what care actually means, I think, and then that could create some space for creativity. Because as it stands, I'm sure everybody leading up to the 9th of September, I'm sure you did, Julie, you're going through every single placement that you've got and making sure that every single placement meets the criteria you need it to make. And so you're spending your time doing that and doing the immediacy of the placements, when I wonder what it could look like with a little bit more creative thought. So I'm just going to move on to kind of another theme. And sorry, Emma, you're sitting there quietly. There's a kind of point made by Reimagining, if I've pronounced your name correctly, where you are making the point about it's all well and good having a framework in place, but your experience is that kind of providers actually move off that framework and do their own thing when, provided with the opportunity, the classic kind of example of the kind of Friday placement. I don't know, Emma, in your work, whether you've kind of wrestled with just that kind of issue and kind of, what advice you might offer in terms of how you can go about changing that relationship.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to 2 points, because there's two ways of looking at this problem, Andrew. One are the authorities that may sit together on that framework, and then two, the providers that may pull down or being pulled down off that framework. And I think actually the responsibility lies on both sides. So one is ensuring that there is kind of nowhere to go for that provider in relation to the framework. So in essence, that those who agree and sign up to the framework stick to it. And that is really, really difficult. But I think goes back to ultimately Julie's point, which is relationships and trust. And I think the work I've done in the Yorkshire and Humber is really exemplary in terms of those individuals working together. And then secondly, I think there are the penalties for going off that framework. And I think unfortunately, Andrew, it has to be carrot and stick. So ultimately, if both either providers or purchasers are going to deviate from that, there has to be some degree of kind of third rail to prevent that. Because if there's not, ultimately what you have is on paper a framework, in reality a market. And as you say on that Friday afternoon phone call, in essence, if there is no local authority provision, you know what the result is. And this is where I think the power goes ultimately back to your first question, Andrew. I think why things have gone well, example Julie used, is also the ability for authorities to self-identify. So groups came together and said, actually, we work well together, we're in a region together. I think the power of that framework is for people to be able to work together on that framework, not being forced to it, but self-identifying. But ultimately, it is a really tricky challenge, but I think it has to be carrot and stick for me, Andrew.
Mm. Well, and I think also, Julie, you made a really interesting point about, perhaps, trying to get at some of the kind of ingredients of success when it comes to kind of regional collaboration. And one of the points you made was it's not just the DCSs and probably actually the assistant directors coming together, but it's also the chief executives and the lead members and the leaders of the councils all coming together, because I think sometimes you need, as it were, one layer to kind of hold the other layer to account if it's not behaving in a very, very collaborative manner. We've had a contribution from somebody actually in the independent sector, Stuart. He's not making a kind of particular point other than that they are providing a kind of an example of what you might call an educare service. He'd be very willing to discuss this further and share ideas with anybody who'd be interested. So I'll put your plug in, Stuart, from ABL Health, and I think probably what we'll be doing, David, is circulating the kind of Q&A as well. That means everybody are kind of some kind of summary of it, so everybody can see kind of what the contributions are and what some of the things, ideas that people might want to kind of exchange with each other. An anonymous contribution, but I think it's exactly the question I was going to put back to the panel is, can you expand a bit on what you think are the regulatory challenges that are mentioned earlier? I think, Colin, you said, I'm not going to pass observation on the impact of some of those regulatory changes. I'm going to ask you to pass comment on it, because I really don't think it's something that we can not pay attention to, because so many people say to me, some of those changes in the regulatory framework are having a major impact and sometimes a perverse consequence. So Colin and then Julie, some thoughts on that? Colin first.
Yeah, of course. So specifically what changed was there was a requirement that every placement must be registered with Ofsted up to the age of 18. That was the guidance that came along with the regulation. And there are a number of certainly up to 16 registered with Ofsted, apologies, but then up to 18, if it's not registered, regulated by Ofsted, then you need to demonstrate exactly why that provision is being used and be really clear on the purpose of that placement and what the outcomes for the child are. Ofsted, we've since had an Ofsted visit looking at this area, and they have if there's a strong rationale as to why you've made the placement, then they have accepted the rationale. And they were very positive about the rationales that we put forward. But the simple challenge is, with that shift in regulation, is in effect, if you don't do that, the clear rationale, you're breaking the law. And then that puts you in a really difficult ethical position. And so I do know some local authorities that have gone as far as the High Court to prove that the placement they're making is an appropriate placement. And what it's done, it's created more tension in the system that was already fraught. And what it's done is it's reinforced that seller's market. It is a seller's market. If you own residential property, you can claim all kinds. And if anyone ever wants to experience exactly what's that like and how frameworks work, for people that aren't in the sector, in actually doing this kind of role, it's that Friday afternoon. Go and sit with placements on a Friday afternoon, because I tell you what, that it is brutal. And if you've got a framework with an authority up the road and yourselves, and this is where the providers benefit. One of the comments earlier, because the provider will say, "Well, look, I'll do it for you off contract for this much. Do you take it or don't you?" Julie. That's the question. So yeah. The regulations made that world even more challenging.
Julie, your thoughts on the regulatory impact? You've frozen, Julie, and I don't know whether we've therefore lost you. Just when I asked
we
you.
didn't, and we have.
No,
Am I back?
You're back. Yes.
Good,
So
yeah,
perhaps you could start again.
Internet connection unstable. Hope it's going to be okay. Yeah, we didn't have any children in unregulated provision, so we didn't have to make any major changes come September. But what we found since September is, as I mentioned in my introduction, that what it's done is moved all the young people that clearly were in unregulated provision into regulated provision, as Colin has said. So it's created even more of a perfect storm where providers, and we've seen, we see evidence of this every single week, will choose the easiest, most manageable young person that they can find to put into their home to look after, to make sure that in terms of inspection by Ofsted, reported incidents, etc., that those are kept to an absolute minimum, not to disrupt the unit, because we know what happens. If you have to make lots of notifications and your Ofsted come and visit and things are not up to scratch, that basically your grading is going to go down, or you actually may be closed down. So we're in a bit of a pick and choose market where we'll know if you have 3 children and this one's most in need, the providers, they'll take that one because they're a lot easier and they're going to be a lot easier to manage on the same money. And I think that's a horrible reality, that we're actually getting placements maybe for children, who don't need them as much. C doesn't need it as much as A because providers are able to pick and choose. So I think, like Colin, it's created a real difficulty. I think the other issue is as well with Ofsted inspection of children's homes. I think if you're running your own provision in a local authority, you'll do absolutely everything you can to hang on to that child, not to disrupt a placement, wherever possible. It's not always the same, unfortunately, within private provision, that you do get the call saying, something's happened, that young person's committed an offence, or they're in this police station, we're not having them back tonight. And you're literally there and then trying to find a placement at extremely short notice. So I think there's lots of issues there around the changes in September, but also how Ofsted inspection framework is working as well within the sector.
And I think it's the case, isn't it? Unfortunately, that sometimes that kind of response from the independent sector provider is driven by anxieties about, how their regulator will kind of regard them if that young person remains in placement. I'm going to close because there was a last contribution from an anonymous attendee about the example of the Peterborough model of using NHS capital to fund specialist residential care, ending with a question: what is the option or the likelihood of DfE and NHS joining together concerning funding and funding step down provision? Unfortunately, none of us can speak for those agencies, but I do know there are colleagues from the DfE on the call, and I think it's a really important point to make. And so I do hope it's one of the things you reflect on after this call, which is, can there be more join up perhaps in some of the thinking in the kind of at the kind of policy making level between DfE, NHS, and the Department for Health and Social Care. I think that's reached the end of our kind of panel contribution, and I'm now going to hand back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and many thanks to our contributors today, Julie, Colin, and Emmett as well. And Andrew, thank you for chairing our panel so expertly today. This is a critical issue in the children's sector, and we'll look to make further contributions to sharing learning about possible alternative approaches in coming months. There'll be a recording of this webinar available through our website in the next couple of working days, along with Emmett's presentation. So please do let colleagues who couldn't be here today know if you think they might be interested in watching in catch-up mode. And you'll also find a library of past webinars available on our website, which may be of interest. And look out for a further webinar in the new year in our Family Hubs series as well. Thank you for joining us today. Do get in touch if there's anything you would like to follow up with us directly. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.